Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Bari, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking about my experience of being an autistic person in secondary school. So before I begin, I just want to give a few disclaimers in relation to trigger warnings as well as locations and use of real names. So, in terms of trigger warnings, I will be covering sensitive topics, mainly in relation to bullying, self harm, suicide, and depression. If you're not used to these topics, it would be best to skip ahead. Also, I will not be using the real location of my secondary school in terms of referring to the name. And if I do refer to people that I used to be friends with or teachers, I will either not name them at all, or in most cases, I would use fake names in order to protect my identity. So, without further ado, let's begin. From personal experience, the education system sets up autistic students for failure. Teachers who work with autistic students are ill equipped when it comes to providing the right support. They either haven't had enough training or failed to put their acquired knowledge into practice, and autistic students end up suffering by falling through the cracks. Instead of teachers trying to help autistic students to thrive, the students themselves often feel like square pegs trying to fit into a round hole, which will never work. From personal experience, if I had to choose which stage of education was the worst, secondary school would always be my first pick. This is because I'd endured years of bullying, and eventually I became depressed and suicidal during year 9 and year 10. When I was 14, I had written a suicide letter. Of course, I will be covering this in part 2 of autism and secondary school. And around the same age, I also attempted to kill myself twice. Once by trying to stab myself with a knife, the other time by trying to swallow a bunch of iron pills that my mum kept at home. It was a very difficult 5 years, and because of what I went through, I started to do therapy. Over these years in secondary school, I lost trust in my teachers and eventually got to a point where I masked away my problems by pretending everything was fine. To add insult to injury, I also stopped talking to teachers about my problems because they never supported me, and they would often assume that I was faking everything for attention when really I was trying to cry out for help. So, to start off, I'm going to talk about my experience of being autistic as a secondary school student in year 7. So, on September 2010, I started secondary school. And before I started, I assumed that I was going to have a fresh start. Despite having certain issues in primary school, I still left with a reasonable group of friends, and the person that used to bully me actually kind of became one of my friends because we ended up having a mutual respect for each other. One of the main negatives about starting secondary school is the fact that my closest friend at the time wasn't going to the same location as me. Although there were other girls from our primary school that attended my secondary school, I wasn't really close friends with them. I just kind of existed in a sense. The first couple of weeks of secondary school were a bit difficult when it came to making friends, as I was often a loner and I still had really bad social anxiety. I would often spend breaks and lunches mostly on my own, reading textbooks, and sometimes when other girls asked me if I wanted to sit with them, I would decline, mainly because I wasn't really sure how they would sort of take me in terms of me explaining that I was autistic. For a long time, that was until I got to university mainly. I hid my autism for years and never really talked about it much because I wasn't sure how people would perceive me. Unfortunately, in secondary school, I had really awful experiences where if I mentioned that I was autistic, people in my secondary school would ask me if I was disabled, or I would be told that I don't look autistic, primarily because I don't exactly have the image of a stereotypical autistic person. In terms of the support, I either didn't get any, or in most cases, I often had assistant teachers who would talk down to me in a patronizing tone, and this made my self esteem decrease. When it came to getting support, it was very difficult, primarily because teachers would come and go practically every term. From year 7 to year 11, my parents, more so my mum, would have to take days off school, primarily. I'm sorry, let me just. From year 7 to year 11, both my parents, primarily my mum, would have to take days off work without extra pay in order to attend meetings to discuss my needs with teachers. This was because a lot of my teachers would either treat me poorly, or if a new teacher came along, they would have no knowledge of my autism because there was a lack of communication. Teachers would consistently lose my records and would neglect to pass them on appropriately. So, in most cases, they had no idea what kind of support I was supposed to get. When it came to certain things like my subjects, I always struggled with academic subjects, especially things like science and languages. I never really took much of an interest in academic subjects because I didn't really care for them. Teaching styles where teachers would expect me to copy notes from a whiteboard or answer questions from textbooks and sheets did not work for me, as I wasn't truly learning anything. If I had to copy notes from a whiteboard and I was too slow as I wanted to make sure I got everything written down properly, the teacher would tell me to copy the person next to me. And this was something I didn't like because I wasn't learning anything. Usually, I was more of a visual learner. I really enjoyed doing practical work, hence why I preferred subjects like art as well as food tech, which later became catering as I did my GCSEs. The reason I liked these particular subjects is because I was allowed to express my creativity without being held back. And on top of that, I was better at practical work than I was with exams, although I will get into this a bit more when I talk about autism and secondary school from my experiences of being in year 11. When it came to other things like extracurriculars, I didn't really do much of them. I used to go to a few clubs here and there in secondary school, like maths club, but then I quit because I lost interest. I had a habit of losing interest in extracurriculars, and sometimes when it came to certain extracurriculars, if there was a certain teacher that I didn't like or something, I would end up quitting. I never really participated in other extracurricular things like student council. I remember in year 7, we were looking to see who to elect for student council, and somebody was saying that I should do it, but I really didn't want to, primarily because I was a very shy student and I never felt like people would take me seriously because I was too quiet. I didn't even participate in school sports days either. In year 7, I was meant to do the relay and then showed up in my uniform because I didn't really want to do it. I just wasn't interested, and my lack of interest meant that I had no intention of participating in anything outside of school. So, when it came to friendship groups, I actually befriended a blonde girl. For personal reasons, I'm just going to give fake names as per mentioned, so I'm just going to call her Mandy. She actually seemed quite nice, and I remember befriending her on the first day of school. And she actually introduced me to a few other girls that she was friends with. So, for further context, I attended an all girls school, which was a huge contrast as my primary school was mixed. And I guess going into an all girls school was a bit of a strange thing for me, especially because befriending girls is very difficult as some have habits of being rude or catty. And as an autistic person, it was very hard to tell if girls would joke around with me or if they would make fun of me. So back to friendships. I befriended Mandy on my first day of school, and she introduced me to a few other girls. There were two girls that she introduced me to who were in the same year as me. So one was named Brandy, and another was named Mariam. They actually seemed pretty cool, and on some occasions I would hang around with them during breaks, even though Brandy and Mariam were in different form classes. Mandy also befriended two other girls that were in year 9 at the time. So one was named Elise and the other was named Nina. And they actually seemed pretty cool as well. So I actually had a little bit of a friendship forming with them, which was nice. The main friendship group that I hung around with in year 7 consisted of three Muslim girls. So one was named Hafsa, the other Zainab, who was her sister, that was in year 8 at the time. And then there was a girl called Maria, who knew Hafsa from primary school. I actually liked Hafsa. She did have a nice personality, and her sister did as well, but there was something about Maria that I didn't really like. And for context, she was actually the main girl that used to bully me in school. With Maria, I felt like she was a bit threatened by my presence, primarily because I was getting close to Hafsa. And sometimes there were instances where I would meet the group during break, and sometimes Maria would tell me to go somewhere else as they had to talk. I actually didn't know at the time that they were talking about me until they mentioned one day that they were talking about me and that they had problems with me because of my echolalia and also because of jokes that I would throw into their conversations, if that made sense. So, in a way, I kind of felt like, again, I had to change myself to fit in with other people. Now, it wasn't just girls in my secondary school that expected me to change myself. Teachers also did this with me as well. During parents' evenings, whenever my mum and I would meet my teachers, they would always say that I was a good student, but the main problem was that I was too quiet. My introversion was always seen as an issue, and I had to fit in with other girls by being loud, which was something that I couldn't do. Teachers always used to think that I was too sensitive as well. At one point, I remember having a migraine, which was really painful, and this was back when I used to do drama. My drama teacher told me that I was weak because I was crying, and they were holding my hand and dragging me to the medical room. From that point, that was where I began to learn to mask emotions. And now, as an adult, whenever I feel upset, I often mask how I feel because I don't want people to use my vulnerability against me. In a sense, I felt like secondary school started to tear me down to a point where my self esteem over the years gradually decreased. I had no idea who I was, and my real self was not exactly accepted. In other words, I felt like I had to conform in order to fit in with the expectations of secondary school. There were instances where in year 7, if I didn't speak much, other girls would either make fun of me or yell at me, and the same thing applied if I cried. I never really liked being in group activities. So when it came to group projects or group activities, I didn't really like to do them, especially if they were in certain subjects like learning for life and PE. And this was because I was working with people that weren't really my friends. And the problem was that I could never really sort of connect with anybody, especially due to my social awkwardness. I also hated doing presentations in school, so whenever we used to do class presentations, we would have to get up and speak in front of everybody, and I always hated doing it because I would get so nervous, and I didn't like the fact that people were staring right through me, if that makes sense. I really struggled to deliver in presentations mainly because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing or because I was afraid of messing up. So sometimes, in certain cases, I would ask my teacher if I could just present in front of them because that way I wouldn't have several pairs of eyes staring at me. During my secondary school years, I found that I also developed a habit of trying to stay out of trouble. From year 7 to year 9, I would show up to my lessons on time at least 30 minutes early because I was afraid of being late, and I also wanted to make sure I didn't receive detentions and behaviour points because it would put a blemish on my record. I guess at the time I was so obsessed and pressurized into trying to be an academic student. All I wanted to do was just do my work and not get into any trouble, but sometimes there were instances where that didn't always happen. There were a couple of instances where I would receive detentions primarily for stupid things like accidentally forgetting my homework or something, and I would get really upset because I never had a detention, so I didn't know what being in one was like. Although by the time I got to around year 9 to year 11, which I will explain in more detail, I stopped caring about those things. And I also stopped caring about showing up to school primarily because I suffered with clinical depression and I just couldn't be bothered to try anymore. When it came to people pleasing as well, unfortunately, I had a habit of being very passive. There were instances where I would allow girls to say, borrow my equipment, and there were instances where it would get lost or trashed. At one point, I remember coming home with less than half a pack of coloured pencils. My mum bought me some brand new ones, and then I ended up having about a few left, maybe a quarter. And my mum asked me what happened to my pack of coloured pencils, and I said that I lent them to my peers, but they forgot to return them to me, or they lost them. Eventually, at later points, if people asked me for equipment, I would say no, but then people would get mad at me. So that was why I felt like I had to people please a lot, because I hated it when people would get mad at me. When it came to year 7, I still had certain interests, primarily in Vocaloid and anime, and I also had an interest in manga comics and video games, but wouldn't really talk about it much, primarily because other girls in my school didn't share those interests, and I knew they would make fun of me. I would often keep these to myself, primarily because I didn't want people to think of me as different or anything. When it came to fairies, I still had a slight interest in them, and I did keep my Felicity Wishes doll for some time until I was about 12 or 13. In a sense, she was kind of like a comfort doll for me because I had her since primary school, and she was one of those dolls that was my absolute favourite. Even if her legs or her clothes would fall apart, I would try my best to sew them back together because I didn't want to get rid of them. Although eventually, when I was about 12 and 13, I did get rid of the doll because I was at a point where I outgrew her. And within this period of time, I became more into smartphones as I got a Blackberry from the age of 11. And I started getting into instant messaging. And eventually, in year 8, which I will talk about when I get to that part, I got into social media. When it came to certain classes, there were instances where if I didn't maintain perfect scores, teachers would have a go at me. In English class in particular, I often had instances where my teacher would have a go at me if I didn't get near perfect scores in spelling tests. Almost every week, we used to do spelling tests where we would have to spell a total of 20 words, and I would often get 20 out of 20 or a near perfect score between 17 and 20. There were a couple of instances where I managed to get a score of probably around 16 or less, and then my teacher was saying it was really bad, and I felt so ashamed of myself because I didn't do perfect. I guess when it came to the education system, I was kind of obsessed with the idea of getting high grades or high levels in general, And teachers used to drill in that if you never maintained these high grades, you were not going to have a successful career. This often happened in year 9, where teachers would go on about the idea of getting a degree in order to obtain a successful career after university. Although this is something I will get to when I talk about my experience in year 9. With year 7 in general, I often had instances where teachers would talk down to me and be very patronizing. One example was when I had to do a presentation back in science, and this was about making a hat. We had a piece of homework where we had to write instructions on how to make one, and I used some terminology that I was capable of understanding, considering that I had an extensive vocabulary for someone who was around 11 to 12 years old. I also did have a reasonably high reading score, so I remember doing a reading test, and I was told that I had the reading age of a 14-year-old for somebody that was quite young. When I was doing my presentation, my science teacher was asking in a very patronizing tone if I understood some of the terminology I was using, and they were actually testing to see if I knew what I meant. They ended up asking me if I copied instructions off the internet, which I didn't. It just wasn't my fault that I did have an extensive range of vocabulary for someone so young. I also had instances where teachers would mispronounce my name a lot. Sometimes teachers would call me Brian, mainly when they would pronounce my name. And I remember during a PE lesson, I actually had a teacher mispronounce my name on purpose, and when I corrected them, they yelled at me by saying they didn't care. It's just really sad because a lot of my teachers had the habit of bringing down people's self esteem. Funnily enough, I wasn't the only person in my school who had issues with certain teachers, as well as additional issues in relation to things like bullying. A lot of girls that I used to be friends with actually came from somewhat dysfunctional family households, and in some cases, there were certain girls I knew who I used to be friends with that were bullied in school or had experiences with depression. One of my friends, well, former friends, who I don't talk to anymore, used to have schizophrenic episodes, and they ended up dropping out of secondary school back in year 10 and decided to cease education, primarily because of this, as well as depression. As per mentioned, I did have friends who were bullied by other girls, and I had friends who had issues with certain teachers. I remember when it came to bullying, at least when I was being picked on by Maria, if I reported it to teachers, they would often tell me that I wasn't being bullied and that she was doing nothing wrong. This is because she had this type of personality where she seemed nice, but then would talk about you behind your back and say things that seemed out of character. On top of this, there were other girls I knew that had issues with her, but again, similar things happened where nothing was done about the situation because the teachers assumed she was doing nothing wrong. Unfortunately, when it came to issues with bullying, there were instances where I would try to stick up for myself, but then I would be the person who would get the blame. I found it very funny that teachers would campaign for anti bullying, but then at the same time, they allowed it to happen, and they would also allow teachers to talk down to students in a certain way. This was why a lot of students tended to have issues in terms of not only bullying, but also things like mental health. On top of that, as per mentioned, I knew quite a few people who had similar experiences. Unfortunately, the school would never really deal with bullying, and they would just like to go on about anti bullying campaigns to make themselves feel better. I think when it came to students' well-being and self safeguarding, teachers were very ill equipped. They never really understood students' needs, and they had a habit of caring more about Ofsted results and reputation rather than the well-being and the safety of their students. In other words, I felt like teachers were often paid to care about me. They weren't really caring about me, they only did their jobs because they got paid to do it, and that was it. To be completely honest, when it came to year 7, I really think this sort of changed my experiences in regards to the education system going forward. It was clearly obvious that the education system was not really perfect for me, and even to this day, there are some instances where I wish I was homeschooled for the remainder of my secondary school education rather than being in a position where I had to endure years of bullying as well as a lack of care from teachers. So now I'm going to be going into a break, so there will be a slight indent after this. And now, after the break, I will be getting into year 8 in more detail. So for now, until the break ends, I'm going to say goodbye. Hello, everyone, and we are back. So, in the next part of this episode, I'm going to be talking about my experiences of autism and secondary school as a year 8 student. So, without further ado, let's begin. So, going into year 8, I would definitely say that I had somewhat similar experiences to year 7. During the early stages of year 8, I actually started getting into social media when I was about 12 years old. This was actually during the first term of the year, and at the time, a lot of girls started to get Facebook accounts, and I remember joining Facebook primarily because I didn't want to be the only person without a social media account. After getting used to Facebook, I joined Twitter when I was around 13 during year 8, and I started to do anime role playing where I would pretend to be like an anime version of myself, and I would send direct messages to different people who had a similar interest. In a sense, doing anime role playing was my way of escaping from reality. So, whenever I had issues with school, social media would kind of help me take myself away from it, especially because online there were people who shared similar interests. And the main thing that I liked about social media back then was that people wouldn't judge you for liking things like anime or Vocaloid, whereas in real life they would, and you would have to kind of hide those interests in order not to appear so different. One thing I really struggled with was trying to befriend people in my old form class. So at the time, one of my closest friends, Mandy, moved to another form because she had issues with one teacher in particular, I think, which was an ICT teacher, and I think she had issues with bullying. And when she moved, I felt like I was on my own, especially because all of the girls I was friends with at the time were in different form classes, and I was just kind of there by myself. It really showed, especially when it came to group activities, because when we would have to find groups to join, I was stuck by myself because everyone else went with their friends, and sometimes I would get really upset to the point where I had migraines because I hated being so alone. I often felt like a third wheel in my main friendship group, so going back to year 7, I mentioned being a part of a main friendship group which consisted of Hafsa, Zainab, and Maria. And Maria was one of the main people who unfortunately bullied me at school, mainly by talking about me behind my back and also giving me dirty looks on occasions because it seemed as if she had a problem with me being around Hafsa, who was her closest friend since primary school. Now, I actually did try moving away to another form class in year 8. So I was trying to see if I could join Mandy's form, so at least I had a friend to talk to, because I couldn't stand being in the same form class as someone who had bullied me. But unfortunately, there were no spaces in that form, so I had to just stay where I was. Again, I would try to stick up for myself, but that didn't help because I would be the main person getting into trouble. And at one point, I had my form tutor and my year leader tell me to apologise to the same person that bullied me. Now, when it came to other issues in year 8, I often remember not liking certain lessons. One of the lessons I didn't really like doing slash subjects in school was French because I had a teacher that was pretty rude, and when it came to French, I wanted to get out of it. And I actually remember at one point I was a school guide once. So when you used to be a school guide, you would have a designated table near the hallways or something, and you would just sit there and wait for teachers to get you to deliver messages. I remember being a school guide on a Tuesday, mainly to get out of doing French. I either wanted to get out of that or ICT, primarily because I had very nasty teachers who would sort of make fun of you and things like that. Like at one point, I remember when I was in French and I needed a tissue or something, and the teacher made fun of me because I needed a tissue to wipe my nose and I didn't have any. There were also instances as well where school trips weren't really that great. So I remember one particular trip that I eventually enjoyed in year 8, which was Chesington. And it wasn't that I didn't like the rides, but what I didn't like was being in the coach on my own because everyone else was with their friends in their form class and our neighbouring form class. And I was on my own, and all my friends were in another coach. I remember going off with this one particular group of Muslim girls, and I kind of felt like I was just there out of obligation so that I didn't feel alone. But when my actual friends in Mandy, Brandy, and Mariam came, I went off with them, and I actually had so much more fun on the trip because they were there and I was with them the rest of the time. I actually remember going on this one ride a couple of times called Vampire, and we had some photos where we were like screaming and stuff. Although I think I lost the photo years ago, so I don't have it anymore, sadly. But when it came to friends, as I mentioned, it was just a very awkward time when most of my friends were in different form classes. And unfortunately, as per mentioned, I also had horrible experiences of being bullied in school yet again, which caused my self esteem to drop. Speaking of bullying, I actually remember there was an instance where I was doing RE, and during my lesson, my RE teacher mentioned a girl who hung herself due to being bullied in the same secondary school by students and teachers. I actually knew this person because they attended the same primary school as me, and I wasn't really close to them, but from what I remember, they seemed to have a very jokey personality. But it was really sad knowing that they hung themselves, and I kind of think that when it comes to bullying, sometimes you have instances where people who are getting bullied appear to be normal, probably because they struggle to mention what is going on. Sometimes, depending on personal experience, especially if you are an autistic person, if you're being bullied, then you are expected to apologize to the same person that bullied you, or you are expected most of the time to get over it. And I think the problem is a lot of teachers like to preach about anti bullying, but then if the actual issue takes place, they do nothing simply because they ignore the issue or they just don't bother enough to care. And that is why, in many cases, depending on how severe bullying can be, you have lots of students that resort to self harm or outright killing themselves. And although I don't promote things like self harm or suicide, these days you can't really blame people for considering it, especially because if you are ripped to shreds to a point where your self esteem is torn apart, then of course you are going to feel really low about yourself. And that was pretty much what happened with me, was that I started to feel low to a point where I eventually attempted to end my life. Although in that case, which I'll get to a bit more in detail when I go into part two of this particular topic, I suppose part of the reason I couldn't go through it was because you didn't know if it was going to work. Because the thing with attempting to commit suicide is that you have no idea if you'll actually end up dying or if you'll end up a vegetable that is unable to do much for themselves. So, going back to the topic of year 8, when it came to my subjects, French was the main one where I wouldn't really try. If we used to get homework, I remember often using Google Translate to sort of cheat my way through. So I would use that to make it look as if I knew what I was writing. And I think at one point, when I was working with Mandy on some French homework, we both had a detention and we had to sort of sit down and redo our work because our teacher knew that we were using Google Translate. At that point, I didn't really care as much, especially because when it came to year 9 and we had to pick our GCSE options, obviously I was not going to pick French because there wouldn't have been any point in picking a subject that I wasn't interested in. Another subject that I didn't really like as much was ICT, again because we had a really rude teacher. In fact, we had two ICT teachers in that particular department, and both of them were pretty nasty to students. Although I had more problems with my year 9 ICT teacher, and with my year 8 ICT teacher, I didn't outright have problems with them. I just didn't like the way they spoke to students. I remember there was this one time where my friend Mandy didn't save her coursework, and my ICT teacher back in year 8 made fun of her for doing that. And the whole class, but myself and one other girl, were laughing at her. And this was actually before she moved to another form class. I remember my former bully Maria was laughing at her as well, and I really didn't like that. It just seemed so sad, you know? And I guess it's because I'm one of those people that doesn't like to see people being made fun of, especially vulnerable people who have learning difficulties or learning disabilities. It's just so upsetting, you know? Now, with year 8, I would probably say that whilst I did have a couple of issues, it wasn't as bad as, say, year 9 or year 10, although it wasn't really perfect. If anything, I would probably say year 11 was one of my more tolerable years, especially because at the time I knew I was leaving the school. Now, when it came to subjects in general, another subject I remember not liking much was PE because of group activities. I actually remember being made fun of for not being able to catch a ball whilst crying, and when it came to certain group activities of PE, the ones I hated the most included basketball and netball. So, whenever we used to do those particular activities, I would often stand way in the back so nobody would pass the ball to me because I really didn't want to participate, and I would often be talking with my friend Mandy quite often. Now, the only sport that I really liked doing in PE was badminton. That was actually my favourite, and it was the only one I was really good at. I wasn't too bad at trampolining, but then again, if I had my period or something, I would just want to get out of it. And sometimes I would do that by avoiding PE. So sometimes I'd just say I was sick one day so that I didn't have to go to PE, because the teachers would still force you to do it if you were on your period, as they didn't really care. So that was basically how I would get out of going. Although I can say in year 9 and year 10, I did have a habit for missing more of my lessons. And this is something I will get to as I talk about my descent into depression and eventual suicidal thoughts. So, I guess this is pretty much all I have to cover in year 8 for now, as this is as far as I can remember. In the next episode, which will be released next Sunday, I will be going into part 2 of my experiences with autism in secondary school, where I'm going to talk about year 9 and year 10. For now, until then, this is Brie, and I would like to say I hope you enjoy your day, and I will see you next week. Bye!